Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In the early 17th century, Europe was engulfed in one of the most devastating conflicts in its history. What began as a struggle for religious dominance between Catholic and Protestant factions escalated into a war that redrew the map of power, shattered entire nations, and left millions dead. The Holy Roman Empire, once a towering force of political and religious authority, found itself locked in a brutal contest not only with rebellious Protestant states, but with the rising ambitions of foreign powers eager to carve their influence into the heart of Central Europe. This war was not fought solely on battlefields. It was fought in burning cities and starved villages, and the collapse of order itself. Armies were no longer composed of noble knights and disciplined ranks of professional soldiers. They were mercenaries, hardened by war, bound not by loyalty but by pay. And when pay ran out, they took what they wanted. The war became a cycle of sieges and massacres where the line between military necessity and wanton destruction vanished. Rulers justified atrocity in the name of faith, and commanders carried out slaughter as a matter of policy. Yet from this abyss, the modern world was shaped. The destruction of entire cities proved that war could no longer be dictated solely by dynastic ambition or religious decree. A new reality had emerged, one where power had to be checked, where alliances could no longer be dictated by faith alone, where the survival of a people could not rest in the hands of a single ruler's divine claim. When the war finally ended after 3 decades of devastation, the treaties that followed would define the balance of power in Europe for centuries to come. They laid the groundwork for the modern nation-state, for the separation of church and state, for the legal recognition of religious coexistence. But this shift didn't happen in a royal court or in a victorious general's tent. It was carved out in the ruins of a city that had been erased, its people slaughtered, its streets turned to ash. What happened there was not just a battle, nor just a siege. It was an event so brutal, so complete in its destruction, that it forced the world to change. The survival of Europe demanded it. Let's now experience the Siege of Magdeburg.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 23, The Siege of Magdeburg, from the 20th of March to the 10th of May, 1631. Protestant forces, unknown. Catholic forces, unknown. The annihilation of Magdeburg was more than a military defeat. It was a warning, one that sent shockwaves through the Protestant states of northern Germany. Those who had hesitated, those who had wavered in their allegiance, now saw the cost of inaction. The city's fall was not a mere state loss. It was an execution carried out with fire and steel. In its smoldering ruins, the Protestant cause found new purpose. Princes who had once stood on the sidelines now turned to Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, seeing in him the only leader capable of standing against the unchecked fury of the Imperial armies. Their support shifted the balance of power, and with their armies now at his back, Gustavus seized the initiative. What had begun as a war of Catholic suppression was now a Protestant resurgence, one that would break the momentum of the Holy Roman Empire and drive the conflict toward a new and decisive phase.
When Martin Luther hammered his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he set Europe on a path that could only lead to blood. The battle lines between Protestant defiance and Catholic supremacy were drawn, and neither side would back down. Throughout the 16th century, Spain waged relentless war in the name of Catholicism, striking down Protestant insurrection wherever it arose. By the late 1500s, the Holy Roman Empire took up the sword, determined to crush the so-called heretics and restore the old order by force. The 30 Years' War ignited in 1618, its fuse lit in the heart of Prague. A power struggle over succession split the city, Catholics on one side, Protestants on the other. Neither would yield, and both knew that compromise was a fool's dream. Count Matthias von Thurn and his rebels made their answer clear. Submission was out of the question. They stormed the palace, seized the Catholic officials, and hurled them from the windows. The message was unmistakable. Rule by Catholic hands would not be tolerated. The Protestant Union rallied to defend its cause, raising an army to hold the city. The Holy Roman Empire struck back, sending its own forces to restore Catholic dominion. The first clash saw the Protestant victorious, but that was the last of their triumphs. The empire regrouped, crushed opposition in battle after battle, and by 1623, Bohemia was firmly under Catholic rule once more. If the Catholic cause had a champion, it was Jan Sarkales, Baron von Tilly, a commander forged in war, ruthless in pursuit of victory. By 1625, the war ignited once more, this time at the hands of King Christian IV of Denmark. He saw an opportunity, not just to lead the Protestant cause, but to carve out dominion over Northern Europe itself. Tilly's victories came one after another, but he was not the only force to reckon with. Albert von Wallenstein, the Duke of Friedland, had assembled a force of his own, an army built for conquest, loyal not to the emperor, but to the man who paid them. In 1629, the Catholic Church tightened its grip with the Edict of Restitution, stripping Protestants of their churches and outlawing their faith across swaths of the empire. Christian's grand ambitions crumbled. Outmaneuvered and outmatched, he was forced to sign the Treaty of Lubeck and slink back to Denmark, his dreams of power now shattered. Wallenstein's rise was unstoppable, so much so that his own allies began to fear him. Catholic princes, wary of his unchecked power, whispered in the emperor's ear. When the fighting lulled, Wallenstein was cast aside, his command stripped from him before he could become an even greater threat than the enemy. In 1630, the war took a decisive turn. King Gustavus II Adolphus of Sweden arrived like a storm. He had turned his once weak nation into a powerhouse of military innovation, forging a force that dominated the Baltic throughout the 1620s. Now his eyes were set on Germany, and he came not to negotiate, but to conquer. His Baltic campaign complete, Gustavus landed in Pomerania in July of 1630. His mission was twofold: to breathe new life into the battered Protestant cause and to tighten Sweden's grip on Pomerania and Prussia, turning the Baltic into his own personal domain. But Gustavus did not fight alone. Behind him, in the shadows of diplomacy, stood Cardinal Richelieu of France, cunning, ruthless, and determined to weaken the Holy Roman Empire. He bankrolled the Swedish war effort, knowing that a divided Germany meant a stronger France. But Gustavus had a problem. The German princes, especially those in the north, saw through his words. He called it a holy war, but they knew power when they saw it. A Swedish empire rising in Germany was just as dangerous as Catholic domination. Pomerania fell into Gustavus's hands with ease, but the real prize, the loyalty of Brandenburg and Saxony, remained out of reach. Elector George Wilhelm hesitated. Elector Johann George stalled. They waited, calculating their odds, unwilling to gamble everything on a foreign king. Their indecision was not just cowardice, it was lethal. Because of it, Magdeburg was left to fend for itself, abandoned when it needed aid the most. Inside Magdeburg, tensions ran high. Protestants and Catholics alike fought for control, neither side willing to be ruled by the other. The city was a powder keg, and the fuse was already burning. Christian William, the former archbishop, saw an opportunity. He promised Gustavus men and loyalty if the Swedish king helped him reclaim his old throne. By June of 1630, the city had risen. Christian William raised the banner of rebellion, seized control, and dared the Holy Roman Empire to take it back. Gustavus made a vow. Magdeburg would not be abandoned. He swore to defend it at his own expense, to stand by its people in their hour of need, and to sign no peace that did not include the city's salvation. Words meant to inspire, words that would haunt him. Christian wasted no time. He rallied troops, struck at the empire's outposts, but he moved too soon. Gustavus was still far off, and now the enemy was watching. As Gustavus fought to carve a path through Brandenburg, the Imperial army closed in. By December, their forces reached Magdeburg's gates, and the siege had begun. Gustavus was in Berlin, locked in negotiation with Elector George Wilhelm, demanding passage for his troops. Then the news arrived. Magdeburg was surrounded. The enemy was literally at the gates. With no time to spare, Gustavus sent Diedrich Falkenberg to take command. The city's leaders placed their fate in his hands, making him governor for as long as the siege would last, for as long as they could hold out. But Falkenberg came alone. No reinforcements, no fresh troops. Gustavus believed the city's defenses and its people were strong enough to endure. He would be proven wrong. The man leading the siege was Baron von Pappenheim, one of Tilly's most aggressive subordinates. He was there to break the city, to starve it, to bring it to its knees. Tilly now stood as the Empire's supreme commander. Wallenstein had been dismissed, cast aside like a loaded cannon, deemed too dangerous to handle. But Tilly would prove just as ruthless. Pappenheim's force was small, only 3,000 men, but it was enough to strangle the region. They looted, burned, and cut off supplies. He lacked the numbers for a full blockade, but he was tightening the noose all the same. But Magdeburg was not united. Inside the walls, pro-Imperial sympathizers worked against Falkenberg, weakening his defenses from within. The enemy wasn't just outside, it was inside the gates. The early months were a waiting game. No all-out assaults, no final stands, just the slow grind of starvation, disease, and the creeping realization that time was running out. Gustavus fought his war on the move. Brandenburg stalled him. Saxony ignored him. So he struck where he could, hitting Imperial garrisons in Mecklenburg, forcing the enemy to react. But the cost of delay was growing, and Magdeburg was paying the price. The Swedes fought through the winter, hammering the enemy when most armies would have gone to ground. It was unorthodox, and it caught the Empire off guard. But Tilly knew what Gustavus was doing, trying to draw him away from Magdeburg. Tilly played the game well. He kept Gustavus occupied, forcing him to fight skirmishes and maneuver endlessly through the bitter months of late 1630 into early 1631. All the while, Magdeburg stood alone, its defenses weakening with every passing day. By mid-March, Tilly had bled the Swedes at Nippenhausen. The victory cost him, but it gave him what he needed: time. He turned his forces back toward Magdeburg, toward Pappenheim, toward the final assault. Gustavus had a choice: rush to Magdeburg's aid or force Tilly into open battle. He hesitated, weighing his options, knowing that the wrong move could doom the city. And he chose battle. Rather than rush blindly toward Magdeburg, he turned his army toward Frankfurt an der Oder, a key stronghold of the Empire. If he could take it, he might force Tilly to abandon the siege. Kustrin tried to stop him. The Elector had ordered the town sealed, refusing to let Swedish troops pass. Gustavus gave no ground. He demanded entry, and he got it. Nothing would stand between him and the Empire's bloodletting. On April the 12th, Gustavus reached Frankfurt an der Oder. A day later, the city was his. He stormed its walls, shattered its garrison of 5,000 to 6,000 men, and put at least 1,700 to the sword. Some say 3,000 died. It wasn't just a victory, it was all-out revenge. Tilly had butchered Swedish troops at Nippenhausen and beyond. So Gustavus answered in kind. But the speed of his triumph worked against him. When Tilly first heard that Gustavus was marching on Frankfurt, he rallied his forces, ready to meet the Swedes head-on, but then came the news. Frankfurt had fallen in a single day. Tilly changed course immediately. He would not give Gustavus the battle he wanted. Instead, he returned to Magdeburg and tightened the siege. The city's doom was now at hand. Pappenheim had been camped outside Magdeburg since December, restless, impatient. He wanted the siege over. He wanted blood. He tried bribery first, a fortune in gold if Falkenberg would surrender. Falkenberg didn't even consider it. Magdeburg would fight to the bitter end. Desperate to end the siege, Pappenheim begged Tilly for reinforcements. He wanted an all-out assault, but Tilly had his own battles to fight and refused to send a single man. So Falkenberg struck first. In early March, he led a sortie against the besiegers, catching them off guard and winning a brief victory, but it changed nothing. On April the 5th, Tilly himself arrived with his full army. Magdeburg was now surrounded by 30,000 men. There would be no escape. The empire wasted no time. Tilly's forces swarmed the city's outer defenses, storming fortifications, cutting down defenders, and capturing vital artillery. The walls were still standing, but the end was coming. But Gustavus did not march. Instead, he wrote to Falkenberg, urging him to hold out for 2 more months. He believed his attacks elsewhere would force Tilly to lift the siege. He was wrong, dead wrong. Tilly would not be swayed. He had suffered humiliation at Frankfurt, and now all of Europe was watching. Magdeburg had to fall. It was a matter of honor. He poured everything into the siege, relentless, unstoppable. He reinforced his army with another 10,000 troops. But with more men came more mouths to feed. Disease ripped through the camp, cutting his numbers in half. But it didn't matter. He still had enough to finish the job. On April the 28th, Tilly made his move. He ordered Pappenheim to storm the Toll Redoubt, the fortress guarding the Elbe Bridge. The fighting was brutal, but after 2 days, the Imperial forces broke through. Falkenberg had no choice. He pulled his men back into the city and burned the bridge behind him. There would be no retreat. Falkenberg thought he was denying the enemy a crossing, but in truth, he had done Tilly a favor. Now the Imperial army could consolidate its strength on the city's side of the river, focusing every man, every gun, every blade on the final attack. The enemy was massing, and Falkenberg knew what was coming, so he gave the order: burn everything. The suburbs were set ablaze. Their ruins turned into smoldering ash. The city would not give the enemy shelter. Tilly demanded surrender. Falkenberg spat in his face. He knew Gustavus was coming, or at least he believed he was. On May 19th, Pappenheim got what he wanted. Tilly relented. The order was given. The siege was over. The attack would begin. Falkenberg had held the city together through sheer will, but the people were losing faith. The soldiers fought, but the civilians hesitated. They were tired, hungry, diseased, desperate. Gustavus was coming, at least. That's what they told themselves. Why risk everything now when salvation was on the horizon? But Gustavus did not appear. Days turned to weeks. The ruling council began whispering of surrender. The resolve of the city was breaking. That hesitation sealed Magdeburg's fate. At dawn, Pappenheim's men stood ready, weapons drawn, prepared to strike. Then, at the last moment, Tilly called it off. The defenders relaxed. The attack hadn't come. They left their posts, sat down to eat, or closed their eyes for a moment's rest. Inside the city, traders made their move. Signals were sent. The gates were left unguarded. The city had let its guard down. 2 hours later, Tilly changed his mind. The attack began, and Magdeburg was not ready. Falkenberg was speaking with the council when he heard the screams. He ran to the walls, sword in hand, rallying the defenders, but it didn't matter. He was cut down in the chaos. Without Falkenberg, command collapsed. The defense crumbled. Desperation set in. Defenders abandoned their posts to fight wherever the enemy had broken through, leaving other gates unguarded, and the city was now wide open. What followed defied comprehension. It would be debated, analyzed, and condemned, but one fact remained. Magdeburg ceased to exist. The slaughter was absolute. The killing did not stop, not when the fighting ended, not when the city lay broken. But worse than the blood was the fire. The city itself was consumed, erased from the earth. Some say Tilly gave the order himself. Friedrich Schiller claimed the Imperials set the fires deliberately, quote, to augment the confusion and to divert the resistance of the inhabitants. The Imperialists had, in the commencements of the assault, fired the town in several places. The wind, rising rapidly, spread the flames till the blaze became universal, end quote. Others blamed the defenders, claiming that once Falkenberg fell, Magdeburg's leaders set their own city ablaze rather than let it fall intact. From Gindley, quote, when it became certain that the enemy could no longer be kept off and that Falkenberg had fallen, they executed their determination. At more than 12 points, the city was at the same time set on fire, and except the cathedral and about 50 houses, sank into soot and ashes, end quote. Some accounts suggest Falkenberg himself gave the order, refusing to leave the city as a prize for the enemy, but in the end, it didn't matter. History placed the blame on Tilly. The sack of Magdeburg became a byword for horror. Few massacres in history matched its savagery. At least 20,000 perished. Some say twice that number. No one counted the dead. There were simply too many. Months of starvation and disease had turned men into animals. The soldiers had fought without pay, knowing their reward would be what they could take. And this war was one of faith. Wars fought over faith are the cruelest of all. There was no mercy. Schiller recorded it plainly. Children, the elderly, the helpless, all were slaughtered. The women suffered worse. The Croat mercenaries who fought under the Imperial banner threw infants into the fire for sport. It was beyond war. It was annihilation. Quote, neither innocent childhood nor helpless old age, neither youth, sex, rank, nor beauty could disarm the fury of the conquerors. Wives were abused in the arms of their husbands, daughters at the feet of their parents, and the defenseless sex exposed to the double sacrifice of virtue and life. No situation, however obscure or however sacred, escaped the rapacity of the enemy. In a single church, 53 women were found beheaded. The Croats amused themselves with throwing children into the flames, end quote. The records of the massacre are countless, and they all tell the same story, one of absolute horror. The fall of Magdeburg was a blow to Gustavus. He had sworn to protect it, he had promised salvation, and now it was gone, and Tilly marched victorious. The dream of a Protestant savior seemed like a cruel joke, but the truth was Gustavus couldn't have saved Magdeburg, not without Saxony's support. Had he rushed in blindly, he would have stretched his army too thin and risked total destruction. He knew it, but that did little to soften the loss. Yet Magdeburg's destruction did something unexpected. It turned Protestant Germany into a furnace of rage. Saxony still hesitated, still refused to commit, until Tilly crossed into its borders. Only then did Johann George of Saxony finally move, and that was enough. Saxony's reluctant alliance with Gustavus changed everything. The Protestant cause would rise again. Months later, the war turned once more. Wallenstein, the empire's discarded warlord, was reinstated. Tilly and Pappenheim prepared for battle. Across the field, Gustavus and Johann George stood ready. The war was far from over. At Breitenfeld, the Saxons shattered early, but their collapse had a purpose. It distracted Wallenstein just long enough. Gustavus seized the moment, and in the chaos, he crushed the Imperial army. It was one of history's greatest victories. The war did not end with Magdeburg's destruction. It didn't end with Breitenfeld's triumph. It didn't end for 17 more years. 17 years where empires clawed at each other, where kings sent men to die over scraps of land, where war became a way of life. But when the blood dried, when the last cities smoldered, when the treaties of Westphalia were finally inked by tired hands, the world that emerged was not the world that had begun this war. No, that world had died. It died in the streets of Magdeburg. It died in the screams of its people. It died in the flames that turned homes, churches, and history itself to ash. Magdeburg was more than a battle. It was a warning, a reckoning, a moment that carved itself into the very soul of Europe. The citizens did not choose to be martyrs, yet martyrs they became. Their suffering, their sacrifice, their total annihilation shattered illusions of divine right and unquestioned rule. No longer could faith alone justify tyranny. No longer could empires dictate belief by the sword. The horrors of Magdeburg made it clear. No peace could last that did not grant all people the right to worship, to govern, to exist without the threat of annihilation. And so when the war finally ended, it was not the might of kings that had shaped the future. It was the memory of the fallen, the foundation of modern Europe, of laws that recognize faith and state as separate, of nations where no single power may dictate the soul of its people, was laid in the ruins of that city. Magdeburg's suffering became the price of a world where belief could stand without fear, where rulers could not wield religion as a weapon of conquest, where the right to exist was no longer a privilege, but a certainty. The war was over, the world had changed, but the echoes of Magdeburg remain, carried through time in the laws we live by, in the freedoms we hold, and the unspoken truth that no city, no people should ever again be made to suffer as they had. Their story did not end in the fire. It became the spark that lit the path to the world we now call our own.